So hello everyone and welcome to today's Learning Network webinar. Thank you so much for joining us and we're delighted to have you all here. My name is Richard Price, I'm the Vice Chair of the Learning Network, but like everybody in our network, we all work professionally within learning and development, so we all have a vested interest in making these things work. So for those of you that are new to us, the Learning Network is a community and is run by volunteers like me and like Arash who are on the call today, and we support learning professionals across the industry with resources, mentoring, events like this, and hopefully a space to grow. It doesn't matter what your level of experience or within your role within learning development, hopefully you get the opportunity to develop your skills as a member of the Learning Network. So today we are using Zoom for our call, and we are welcoming anybody to use the chat throughout the discussion, and it's going to be quite informal today, so we've given everybody the opportunity to unmute themselves and use the microphone as well if you wanted to have a discussion with today's guest speaker, Charlie. So if you have any questions, you pop them in the Q&A box or within the chat, or like I say, feel free to unmute yourself because it's going to be quite an informal session today. Just as an awareness, today's session is being recorded and it'll be available to members via the dashboard after the event and on our YouTube channel. So with the housekeeping out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Charlie Kneen, from Industry Partners Solve Together. So industry partners are people that are supportive of the Learning Network and of the work that we are doing to develop skills and things like that. They'll be leading today's session, and Charlie is hugely experienced working in sort of large corporate businesses, including, he said, BP, and also medium-sized agencies and consultancy who've been working in the industry for more than 15 years. Before starting Solve Together just 6 years ago. So with that in mind, Phil, I'm going to hand over to you, Charlie, so that you can share your screen and hopefully share some insights as well.
Good stuff. Still hearing me okay? Better check before we start. Yeah, good stuff. All right. Well, thanks for joining. Those who have joined, as we've just heard, please do just pop some stuff in chat as we're working through this to keep it informal, and you can also unmute yourself and interrupt me at any time. I thought when I was given the opportunity to share a little bit about what we're doing on skills, I think before you joined, I was having a chat with the team here at the Learning Network about what are they hearing and what are they seeing in the Learning Network around skills. I think there's still a lot of confusion and there's a lot of talk. So what I wanted to do today is actually show you some stuff that we've been doing so you can kind of get a sense of hopefully the lessons learned, because it's not been smooth sailing. We've had to untangle quite a lot of jargon and quite a lot of, as I said before, a bit of confusion around it. So I will share, I do have some slides. As much for anything, it's for me to structure my thoughts and how I'm going to present what we're doing, but I'll just introduce Solve Together a little bit more detail before we do this. No, I don't want to share that one. I want to share this one. There we go.
Good.
All good. So Solve Together, yeah, founded 2019, about 4 months before COVID. We spent a load of time in Denmark before that. And then we're doing a lot of work virtually with our initial clients in Denmark before we kind of expanded. And now we do work with loads of people, including some of these brands that you can see on screen here. We also seem to be quite good at winning awards. And I think that's probably because we do very creative things and we do focus a lot of impact on impacts. But our whole business is really focused on a human-centered design methodology and applying that to learning and development. So more and more I'm seeing us as less of an L&D company and more of a human-centered design company that happens to sort of sit somewhere in between L&D, culture, and business performance. So what I'm going to talk about first is the problem statement around skills, and I'd be delighted to hear some of your thoughts as well about, what is the problem we're trying to solve with skills. It's always the problem that we ask when we start any project or program working with a client. I'm then just going to get straight into it and share a couple of examples of skills projects we've done and what we've learned from that. And then let's have a chat about your experiences and your challenges around skills too, and hopefully I can share some insight based on what we've done. Some of you may have seen this before. Show of hands, actually, and who knows about or has heard of 5DI as a model of learning design? Ash has, yeah, a couple of people. Okay, fine. In a nutshell, it's just IDEO, which was the company that was as a design company based out of California, were responsible for the concept, or partly responsible for the concept of design thinking, and it's a methodology for designing products and services. The 5DI model, which is you'll find in Nick Shackleton's book, How People Learn, is basically the same model with different words. But the beauty of it is it's close to ADDIE in the 60s, but it's not that. The key differentiator really is probably these first two phases, which is define and discover, where you're defining the problem to solve in measurable terms, and then doing research to figure out, I suppose, what's the pain points on the ground. So when you're designing a solution, you're solving a problem for the audience rather than just solving a problem for the business. So that's our way of doing every project in a way. And we also work with clients and companies on how to do human-centered design as well. It's more than just following the model. It turns out actually you need to structure your team differently and actually think about your work differently too. So yeah, skills stuff, let's get into that. So the problem that I see with skills is, or the skills problem, and I'm looking over here because I've got my screen's over here, so that's why I'm not necessarily looking directly into the camera. The skills thing sort of appeared over the last sort of 3 years, and I think it's a tech-enabled concept in the sense that it wasn't possible before technology was able to amalgamate and tag different roles with different skills. So it's extremely complex. There's a lot of emerging technology companies off the back of skills and a skills-first organization. I think a lot of companies have tried to pivot. So you'll see a lot of stuff coming out of Degreed as an example about how they're enabling skills, a skills-based organization. And we can get into technology a little bit later. But the reality is it's complex. And the promise of a skills-based organization is that you should be able to take a look at your employee base and your workforce, tag your skills within that workforce, and then basically be able to adapt and move your organization to fit the market trends or fit the strategy of the business. This is actually what consultancies have been doing for many, many years. I used to work in a consultancy at PA Consulting for a couple of years. It's the way they've done it in the sense that you have the profile internally, and then you have your skills tagged to it. And what's supposed to happen is a resourcing manager is meant to do a search for the skills on a particular project, find you, align you to that project, and then off you go. You're kind of on the engagement and charging the client for your time. The reality is you get into the company, and this is the case of any professional services firm. You get into a company, you get put on a project, you build your network within that project, and then future projects come through your network. So the skills-based concept or the skills-first organization works in theory, but there's a lot of it that doesn't work in practice. And I'll share a little bit about our experience of trying to make it work and how and lessons learned on that. So the outcome of hopefully this session, but also more broadly of skills-based organizations, is again that piece about being able to look at an employee base as essentially a bucket of skilled people that you can apply and you can resource to deliver value to your business. But similarly, it's a way of enabling employees to take a more fluid approach to their careers as well, so they're not stuck in one track, because actually the skills they have in one area might be applicable to another area. And again, I've got some examples of where that's been the case. And so there's the business perspective, which is make better use of the skills you have, make more of what you have, which I think in this current financial climate, I'm hearing from a lot of people that, it's a struggle out there. It's making better use of what you've got. But then from an employee perspective, you're enabling better mobility, better retention, better market agility, and better engagement, because people feel more empowered. They have more flexibility in their careers. They can see what their future looks like. At least that's the dream. That's the promise of skills. And please feel free to drop some questions and whatnot into chat on that front. I'm going to move forward, and I'll pause after the case studies to see if there's any questions on that stuff. So here's a case study from a professional services firm, one of the big ones. I'm not going to say who it is, but the initial conversation I had with the client was, we want to do some skill stuff. Can you make us a platform? Because we know you can do platforms. And the first question we always ask is, why do you want to do that? And when the answer was pretty much, we don't really know, the next stage of that was, okay, well, let's define the problem you're solving, going back to your 5DI model. Define the problem you're solving. Why do you want to build a platform? And then do discovery to validate some of the assumptions within that problem statement. So in this case, the problem they were trying to solve was they had very technical people in the consulting part of their business, and what they had was quite clear tracks for consulting, like in the company we're talking about, but in most professional services firms, your first 5 years at the firm is kind of mapped out already. You know where you're going to get promoted. So by year 5, you're pretty much going to guarantee to be a manager unless you fall off the wagon at some point. So but they didn't have the same career pathways or tracks for technical talent, and they were challenged by, let's say, tech companies that were stealing their talent basically. So they were, one of the big four consultancies wanting to position themselves as technically capable for their clients, but they were losing talent to some of the tech companies that I suppose like Meta and Google, which had that brand, but also much more focus on tech. And they wanted to give people a clear career pathway. And within the company at the time, there were these networks or communities, sometimes called squads, sometimes called crafts. And so this was about understanding what the picture was across consulting, what sort of roles these technical people were taking on, and then how was that benefiting both the firm but also the people themselves. So what we ended up doing, and I'm going to grade out the stuff that's sensitive, and some of it isn't even from that project, but it gives you a sense of the type of stuff we did. We did the research first to understand what the picture was. What we found was a big inconsistency essentially across the whole firm in consulting. So depending on who you knew would decide on how successful you were really in your technical role and how engaged you were, because again, it's a networked organization. It's not as clear cut and structured as the organization would like. So having understood that, we then did some user stories and prioritization. So user stories is a kind of product design approach where you're basically thinking about what are the use cases for the thing that we end up building. So we had use cases from the perspective of the employees, but also from the perspective of the community owners and the perspective of the resourcing managers, the people that I mentioned earlier, essentially put people onto projects, having a long list and then prioritizing those with the stakeholders. And then we started thinking about tech. So then we started thinking about, okay, well, what are the use cases, and then how is technology going to serve this? And instead of going out to the market and procuring something, the firm decided to build their own thing bespoke. Pros and cons of doing that. Again, I'll come on to that in a bit. And then we also supported them around the sort of marketing and campaigns for an initial launch of 4 of the squads, or 4 of the vertical technical areas, which was then used kind of more holistically across the consulting part of the firm to promote the concept of putting these people into kind of technical communities. When we returned to this project about 2 years after the launch, the big problem they found, and this is one of the lessons learned, is that adoption was a problem, adoption was a challenge. And the reason for that was the idea of having your skills hosted on a technical, on a piece of technology was very useful for a junior colleague because they could orientate themselves, i.e. where are they, in what skill, what specialism, what does their future look like, their career path look like, what are the other things that exist that they can do, etc., etc. So orientation, very useful for junior employees, very useful for leaders as well to basically go on this website, have a look at the skills, do the self-assessment, figure out what you want to do next. So that, from that perspective, really good. After about 5 years, when people start to get to grips with the technical skill, the use case or the validity of the tool massively dropped off to the point where people weren't really using it at all unless they were really pushed. So the next phase of work for this was adoption. And there's a lesson learned in that, which is don't think about adoption after you've launched the tech. Think about adoption first. And so I'll come on to a second case study, and then I'll kind of share some more lessons learned on both. So the second example, skills-based example, was shipping organization. So the brief to us at the time was, can you build us a shiny customer experience program? And again, first question we ask is, why do you want to build a shiny customer experience program? And the reason for that was they had a strategy over a sort of 3-4 year period, which was to become more consultative. So I suppose there's a link between those two things. Become quote unquote trusted advisors, which is based on a book actually by some PA consulting, I think PA consulting consultants actually. And so what they needed to do was shift their shipping surveyors to people who go onto ships, look at the ships, figure out if they're still going to float when they relaunch them or fix them, or when they're building a ship, they have the plans and they survey the plans. Those people who are very highly technical, they wanted to shift them into less of an auditor type mindset and more into a customer experience or customer service mindset. And the way we approached that was partly going through the same process really of looking at the current skills base, both from a technical and non-technical perspective, doing a data map. I've got a video, a vision of that. So like I say, doing the research, understanding the context, the pain points, etc., and then doing a data modeling exercise to understand what's the current data set look like from a technical and non-technical perspective. Doing a tech review, so looking at all the available external tech and internal tech, and then making a judgment call as to whether or not there's something you could buy off the shelf or whether you'd have to build your own. And then again, launching with marketing, using marketing campaigns. So a similar story, I would say the difference between this one, which was actually the second one, and the first one, is we started more with adoption and less with the tech. But the big challenge on this learning, or big learning from this one, was that the client, rightly or wrongly, wanted to disconnect the technical skills from the non-technical skills, because the technical skills was basically a 1,500 line spreadsheet of different technical skills. And it was going to be too stressful and too hard to turn that into something that was user-friendly for the target audience. And so the focus became more on the non-technical side. But the problem with, if you're trying to sell a use case and drive adoption in for technical people, is they're really only interested in the technical side of the role. So again, adoption's a challenge. So those are the two case studies. And I'll finish on this. What I think we've learned is that the way that most people are thinking about skills, because it's kind of a technology-based phenomenon, is they're starting with the technology. So the way it works on the left-hand side is you've got some data, and that data might be your roles. It might be you've got an existing competency framework, which is those competency frameworks where there's lots of layers, or you've procured some kind of bucket of skills. So there's lots of technologies out there where you can essentially procure data pools of lots and lots of skills to tag your roles with. You then tag your roles with skills, and then you procure some tech to present that to your user group. At which point you then start thinking about adoption. So I suppose it's sunk cost fallacy. You spend the money on the tech. Now we need to figure out how to get it to work. And that's when you start thinking about user stories. Like, we've got the tech. We know we think wants to use this. How do we then get them to use it? Okay, here are some ways we can get them to use it. And then if you follow that breadcrumb further down the chain, all of these things basically end up in, how do we shove content down people's throats? Because what people are really thinking about in learning often is, how do we get this really nice content that we've developed in our content library and get people to look at it? And so using this whole skills journey often ends up in, okay, you've got a skill here and there's a gap. How are we going to plug that gap? We'll plug it with some content because we've spent lots of money on this content library. So this is what I'm seeing in, I suppose, in a lot of cases in the skills conversation, which is actually it's a focus on content if you scratch the surface. And also it's a preoccupation with technology rather than what problem are we trying to solve. So this is, I suppose, what I see as the kind of current state or the problem state. And then this is a future state. So we call it a portfolio framework. So instead of looking at the technology first, what we suggest is, and what we've done with the clients, some of the clients I mentioned before, you start with a business strategy. So what is the outcome of the next 3 to 4 year business plan? And actually there's a lot of stakeholders, you can't really articulate that. So first job for L&D is have the conversation with the exec, get them to clearly articulate what does it actually tangibly mean to achieve your strategy, and then work backwards from the outcome. At the same time, you need to understand your employee base. This is where the research comes in, your discovery. What are their goals? What are their ambitions for their careers? And they're not all going to be the same, and they're not going to be linear either. But you've got to have a way of allowing people to articulate that. So then what you have is, instead of trying to cover all bases with all skills, so tagging all roles with all skills and trying to have a complex plan for their career path, which they're never going to follow anyway, instead just focus on the, say, top 3 things the company cares about. So in this day and age, it's probably going to be something like AI, maybe something like cybersecurity, and there's probably leadership in there somewhere too. So if those are the hot skills, then those are the things to focus on. And all you need to then do is communicate that to your audience base. So they can go off in whatever career path they want, but you've got to know that to achieve the strategy that this business has, what we really value and care about is these 3 things. So it's minimizing the skills overload, which is another problem we have, which is a lot of tech has too many features and too many skills, and it's just trying to force too much information at people who frankly don't have the time and probably don't really care. At which point, if you have your hot skills and your expectations from the perspective of the role, you've then got the opportunity to think about tech. So what are the use cases for this technology, and how is it actually going to be adopted? So starting with the end point, which is, how are we going to get people to actually use this thing? Or instead of asking that question, I suppose it's, how can we make their lives easier? And if you boil it all down, usually it's just, how can a manager have a good conversation with a person about their career journey? Do you even need a piece of technology to enable that? How can we get the business to leverage more of the skills that are in the pool of employees that it has? Those are the use cases. Those are the reasons why this technology is adopted. And then you can think about tech. And I think what we've come to is that the kind of known truths about careers is that people always want to capture the work they're doing and use it as evidence in performance conversations. So having done this research recently for another big firm, we know that mid-year and end of year tends to be run through a spreadsheet, and it's a process where you have your objectives, and then you at the end of your year, you gather evidence that you've done things that you said you were going to do. So people have this career portfolio of work that they've done, which they only really capture in performance conversations. So enabling that through the tech is one big part of it. And the other big part of it is, we know that people want to take work they've done with them to their next job. Whether companies like it or not, it happens. People download stuff, people vanillarize it and take it with them. So enabling that kind of career-based approach to skills is another kind of key feature of how we're thinking about this. And then rather than thinking about content as the outcome, we're thinking about evidence as the outcome. So evidence can be peer testimonials, can be documentation, it can be visuals of work done. It's just a different way of thinking about the outcome of skills being something that is useful and practical for the person, but also for the business. So now I'm going to talk you through all of the lessons learned. But before that, I do that, I'm just going to check in to see if I've got any questions. So ask your questions now. Feel free to unmute yourself. I'm just going to check my chat.
Yeah,
Go for it.
Actually, Charlie, and I think Samir and I probably have a very similar question, and I think you possibly answered it actually. So we're talking a little bit about measuring this, and just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should. But also, you've kind of alluded to a little bit about how you measure competence and confidence. So by capturing those peer testimonials and things like that, are you essentially creating a bucket for all of these pieces of evidence to go into that prove that somebody is or isn't competent?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. The way that we describe it is, skills have to be evidenceable, and measurable, and observable. So there's those 3 things. We've got a skill, I'll come on to it at the end, but there's a skills handbook which we created specifically, which outlines some of this stuff. So I can flash it up. But one of the big problems you've got with these giant skills buckets and the way that people evidence them is that they're, especially with you have this leveling thing, where essentially competence is based on sort of beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And what you end up with if you do it that way is many more skills than you need. So what we've ended up designing is essentially a standardized set of indicators based on the medical profession, see one, do one, teach one. So the way that we are kind of thinking about and working on measurement for the examples that I shared is there is essentially a 360 assessment. So you've got your leadership view, you've got your peer view, you've got your personal view on where your skills are. And then you've got practical evidence of you being able to do those things. So to the point about skills being evidenceable, measurable, and observable, I need to be able to show that I have a skill. It's no good me saying conceptually I can do negotiation or I can do active listening without being able to evidence that in some way. And there are plenty of ways you can capture evidence. It can be screenshots, it can be recordings of videos, it could be workshop recordings, it could be templates, completed spreadsheets, whatever. Ideally, it's more kind of quantitative than that. It could be set, if you're doing sales enablement, it could be number of sales, etc. So kind of going off on a tangent, but measurement's quite complex. Let me think if I can. Don't think I've got an example I can show, but I can talk you through it. So in measurement, the way that we do this in our define stage on 5DI, let me get my slides back up. What we are essentially doing is defining the measurable outcomes. So if I go back to the problem statement here. And then stand by. Tell me a bit of tech issue here. Let's do that again.
It's coming through now.
Yeah, cool. So by doing this, we make sure that we have we have numbers against these metrics. So if you're given a project, if you scratch deep enough, usually what you'll find is you're sitting for HR and L&D, you're usually talking about engagement, retention, attrition. Those are kind of the main things that you're focused on. So even in a leadership program, it's like, what problem are you trying to solve? People are disengaged because leadership don't communicate well, or people are leaving the business because the leaders are horrible, or we can't retain our best talent because they're being poached because they don't have a career path. And then if you scratch a little bit further than that, you're basically talking about money. Everything we do in L&D is about money. It's not, we live in a capitalist system, and ultimately this is about how much money can we make for the organization, or in some other cases, how much money can we save for the organization. So if you link revenue to engagement, what we're talking about is, or retention, we're talking about productivity. So how much stuff are we producing? We're talking about retention, which is how much money are we having to pay to find a new person because somebody has left? What's the reputational damage of somebody leaving in a negative way, etc.? What is the revenue impact of losing some junior talent because they don't feel like they've got the career mobility that they need? So it's all about money, and you just need to you're essentially rolling up from the individual observable experience of a skill. So in this case, let's say it's a one-to-one between a manager and a direct report. And what we want to happen is a manager can have a good conversation with a direct report about their skills journey, which gives them motivation, career mobility, engagement, etc., etc. That's the pointy and observable end of a skills-based organization. The ultimate measurement, or the ultimate measure for that metric for that, is revenue. Because if you have a bad experience of your one-to-one, whether it be manager or from the perspective of the user, there's impacts on engagement, likelihood of attrition, etc., etc. So the opportunity cost of getting this right is essentially the amount it costs you to find a new person times the number of people you could potentially lose, or the number of people you are losing. And so the argument you can make from a measurement perspective as to why this is important is to have a conversation with the stakeholders to say, look, our attrition rate is 10% at the moment. That means if it costs on average £3,000 to hire a new person into the company, and we've got, I don't know, 10,000 people, then you can do the numbers and say that the opportunity, if we shift this by 5%, is, X. So that's, from a measurement perspective, in our defined stage of our 5DI model or a human-centered design model, it's always about what is the measurable outcome and what is the context, observable context that can prove the efficacy of what we're doing. So really the strength of this approach, or our approach, is really in getting this bit right, the defined bit right, and then doing the right research to make sure that you're designing a thing that people actually want to use and are actually going to adopt because it's solving a problem for them. So stage one is about impact, and stage two is about adoption. And then your design, develop, deploy, and iterate is really just about how do we then build the thing that's going to solve those problems both for your end user and your business. So hopefully, I could go on all day about measurement, but that's hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense.
Well, that's really useful, and I think Bill said that skills without performance means things like that's music to his ears, and I think probably music to all of us, because I think being able to measure and demonstrate performance based on skills is kind of the holy grail of what we've always wanted to achieve with L&D. So this is really good stuff. Nigel has his hand raised.
Yeah, go on, Nigel.
Waiting very patiently as a true proper Brit. Yeah, I'm interested your thoughts. So sort of almost widening it and taking it from the other end. So I'm like you. I'm an industry partner as well. But so I've sold to the L&D function or run sales teams that have sold to the L&D function for the last 20 odd years. And I'm interested in your thoughts, because my experience is often organizations don't know why their best people are their best people. So actually, what is the skill that drives performance in any particular role? Because presumably that's what those are the ones you want. And so I'm interested in your experience, because mine is a lot of businesses are really bad at understanding why their best people are their best people.
Yeah, it's interesting because of one of the examples we gave. The first one I gave, when we started doing that project, the problem we were solving was essentially down to attrition and retention, as I mentioned, being in a competitive space of technology and having people poached. When we went back to them 2 years later, when they were like, why isn't this working? Partly because they didn't listen to all the recommendations we made, but also because the business had changed. So the business, under kind of pressure from the market, was really worried about making money, basically. It was all about sales, all about commercial value. And so the latest piece of work we did was about, okay, if we were to look at what we've currently got and rethink it from a commercial value perspective, how would this be different? Or how could we position this and make this more of a commercial opportunity to the rest of the business rather than a skills and HR thing? So that's kind of where that's gone to. And the reason I mention it is because, to your point about people not necessarily knowing what skills make people valuable to the business, for me, it's all about, comes back to money. It comes back to money and what is ultimately what is the impact of that person doing the work in a positive or negative sense. In the technical sphere as well, what we found is a lot of technical people don't want to do sales, and consulting is a good, professional services is a good area, because in the sense, if you want to progress in the business, you have to be doing sales. Become a partner in a big firm, you have to be doing some kind of proposition design and then selling that. But technical people don't want to do that because they find it icky or they don't like it or whatever. And so what we've had to do is kind of reposition commerciality in a more technical way. So the argument we're making to them really is, you can go off and you can be an expert in this particular area. Let's say it's renewable fuels. You can be an expert in renewable fuels, but the value to the business has to be making more money in some way. So it's a different form of sales, but ultimately what you need to be doing is producing white papers, doing research, speaking at conferences. So you're indirectly selling rather than directly selling. And so to go back to your earlier point, which is businesses don't know what performance looks like for any particular role. For me, it's always about just figuring out, well, what is the financial benefit or financial cost of doing this well or not doing this well.
To
Yeah.
defend the commercial people, being one, if you're a senior exec in a business, by law you have to act in the best interest of the shareholders. You have to. If you, and then, like I said, I've sold and run sales functions to L&D for a long time. If you're not linking what you want to do to those hard metrics, revenue, EBITDA, client acquisition, client retention, talent acquisition, talent retention, and I 100% agree, it's hard to do. But if you're not linking to it, at some point the CFO is going to look at a line item and go, that's no value. That's you so yeah, you have to be doing. I thought it was interesting because what you're talking about, that model, because I wasn't familiar with it, but I've seen similar. What you're talking about is what I would call day one consultative selling. You want to, the number of times I've been asked, we want to do leadership development when I've worked for some pretty big players in leadership development. And my first question is, fantastic, why? Now, great, I'm selling it, so I want to sell it to you, but why do you want to do it? Because if I'm selling you a, £500,000 program, which I'm not willing, because it's being recorded, but I'm willing to have an off the record chat about a situation with one of your previous employers, Charlie. If I'm selling you that, again, the CFO is going to have to sign off on that kind of spend. Well, we've got to be a measurable impact.
Yeah, and the AI thing I think is an interesting one, particularly now, because I think what AI is doing is demonstrating the futility of what L&D has been doing for a long time, which is this kind of content production treadmill that we've been on. And if you strip away some of the some of the grunt work that particularly in professional services, a lot of the more junior grades do. So a lot of graduates traditionally would do things like analysis. They do PowerPoint decks and turning data into reports for partners to present to clients. You strip all of that stuff away, and what you're left with is essentially a lot of heads that aren't really able to deliver anything more quickly than an AI. So it's really going to put a lot of pressure on individual employees to prove their value, but also for businesses, if they want to have that kind of junior talent coming up the ranks, being able to create some kind of a career journey for people moving through that actually is compelling, because they can't be sitting around twiddling their thumbs for 10 years waiting to have their opportunity to do something interesting and to speak to clients. So it's creating more of because traditionally it was more of a pyramid where you have like a small number of partners at the top, and then you have lots and lots of grads at the bottom that they tend to throw at lots of projects. But now it's more of a kind of a square or rectangle where you basically get the same number at the beginning when people are rolling up.
The ones that have kind of got it, the ones that I think are struggling are the ones that still have that fee earning billable hours model, which which I'm familiar with one or two. But I also think your point about not sales. So again, I'm a professional sales guy. So the company I work for at the moment our business model is channel. So I lead a channel of businesses that most of them don't employ salespeople. They don't want to sell. They want to do delivery. Great, but you know what? If you don't sell it first, you've got nothing to deliver.
Yeah, one thing I would say is that I started Salt Together with business partner Morten Bond, who retired last year. Good for him. But I've had to take on more of the business side of things, and I think it's been a really steep learning curve, but incredibly valuable for me as a consultant to understand how business works. Essentially, the pillars that need to work together, and where if you have a gap in any of those pillars, the impact is quite significant. And also things like the impact as a small business of making the wrong hire and what that can do to your ultimately to your revenue for the year, and ultimately whether you can employ the team that you've got and so on. So it's been I'm now at a point where everyone in my business has to be able to sell first. I can teach them how to do human-centered design,
Yeah.
but I can't necessarily teach people to have the motivation to want to sell work and be commercial. But I think that all of the stuff we've talked about with regards to skills, AI, cyber security, and all those kind of trends, it's making it more and more important for people within our industry and L&D to have a broader and more proactive view when it comes to what's my preferred commercial value and how am I actually adding value to the business. So yeah, it's an interesting time.
It is. I think your point, without trying to derail the conversation, but with if organize, and I'm quite a bit of a Luddite, so but even I'm using AI. I was doing some research about tax implications to do with Azerbaijan. Now, if it wasn't for you, and I'm just using the free Chat GPT. If at some point I will need to get someone with the expertise to write the contract, but I can do a certain amount of up to a point where I don't need their expertise. I can do a point when I'm doing my research. Is it worth my time and effort investing there? Before, and a few years ago, I would all have to go out to some expert charging me, £1,000 an hour.
Yeah, I mean, there is a problem with, we're a consultancy basically. So there is a problem with AI making things a lot faster, particularly when you're charging people time and materials. So if I'm going to charge people 30 grand to do a deep dive piece of research, but I can do it in, 15 minutes using a combination of AI and research tool, then what do I charge the client? Am I charging them for my time? Because it doesn't really make sense. I'm charging them my expertise. Yeah. Anyway, we've only got 15 minutes left. So I wanted to share the kind of lessons learned. So what I've done is I've pulled these together based on all of the experience we've had working around skills at the moment. Thanks, Lizzie. And no, I keep showing the wrong screen. 2 seconds, sorry. Here we go. Okay. So lessons learned. This is kind of everything amalgamated that I've just shared, amalgamated into a list. So I'll just talk these through. In order to have a skills-based organization, you need a single source of truth for skills. So you need to have the data first. Like I said, it's a tech-enabled trend. Where you get that data from, sometimes it's already exists internally. Sometimes you can essentially integrate with some kind of data pool that will pull that through. But there's a critical point in here, which is around granularity. Skills that are things like kind of high level capabilities or competencies like negotiation are pretty useless in a conversation because, I could rate myself in negotiation, but there are multiple contexts in which negotiation is useful. So it's not meaningful for me to look at my skill set at that level, and you need to go a step deeper. So again, in the white paper that I'll share at the end, we kind of go through a taxonomy that we created for the clients I shared earlier. And you can buy, you can build skills directories yourself. So we did that for the first client, or you can buy them off the shelf. Both come with problems. Second thing is, you need to find a way of validating skills. One of the big things that we find when these technologies or platforms are launched is people don't trust the data. They don't trust people are going to be honest about skills they say they have. And in a more technical sense, they often need to be signed off by a technical person, a technical role. And there's a backlog there. So you end up with people who have completed the course or done the thing, but can't actually get the certificate, which in the case of shipping means that they can't actually get on the ship to do the survey they're supposed to do because they haven't been signed off yet. And secondly, non-technical skills are hard to validate, right? How do you validate someone who can do good active listening? It's basically impossible, which is why in the whole skills conversation, it's not really about the framework. It's about what's the observable behavior that you can then track. So how are you going to evidence that you can do good communication? You've got to think that through too. Use cases that relate to utility and adoption of technology. So that's what I was saying earlier about rather than thinking about the technology that you have or the frameworks that currently exist, you think about the pointy end. What is the actual thing you want to happen in a tangible way that you can observe? And if you go down a technical route, what tends to happen is this thing called feature bloating, which is you buy a piece of tech which gets bigger and bigger and more complex, or you build a bit of tech gets bigger and bigger and more complex because you're trying to address too many use cases rather than just focusing on the one thing that'd be useful to get the result that you want, which is why, again, coming back to the earlier point around measurement, probably be really clear about what you're trying to achieve, right, and try not to get distracted too much with the technology side of things. We've done a lot of work where it's been really hard to take the stakeholders along on the journey with us because there's a lot of, I mean, it's always difficult with stakeholders. They're always the experts because they've gone to university and schools and know how learning should look. But really it's about making sure you pin them down on, okay, well, if you want this to happen, why do you want it to happen, to the earlier point we were making around it. And then in terms of bringing people along with you, involving them in the process of designing the workshops, doing the use cases, recording those things and sending it out, but also making sure there's a multi-channel marketing plan essentially to make sure that the whole organization understands why you're doing it and what benefit you're getting from it. Senior sponsorship is also very useful. I'm sure that's not a surprise to you, but the other problem we found is that sponsors want a quick fix in a short period of time because that's what they promised to their CEO. And so again, this is about taking them on the journey with you. It's a 3-year, 4-year journey to become a skills-based organization. It's not something that happens overnight. The other thing that I've seen is that skills-based organization is decoupled from performance management. So, one of the earlier case studies I showed you, it was decoupled completely because it was previously a community setup, and then it became something more formalized. But if you don't, but people were still expecting if they achieved a certain number of skill credits to then get promoted, even though it wasn't directly related to the performance management process. But similarly, no one was using it because it wasn't related to the performance management process. So you kind of have to, in my view, you have to integrate it to the current HR setup. So having skills as separate to performance doesn't make any sense. You've got to link those two together. It's painful, but it has to be done. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time and money, basically. A lot of this rides on the leader's ability to be able to have a skills-based conversation with their employees. If you miss that bit out, again, you'll struggle with adoption. But also capability varies. So in any deployment of any skill solution, you've got to think about multi-level from the top all the way through the organization to the bottom, and make sure people have the skills and the context to be able to have the conversation, and they have the big picture as well as the capability at a more granular level to be able to do what you need them to do. I talked about this earlier. Hot skills, prioritize the top 3 things that business cares about to achieve the strategy. Don't get bogged down in all of the possible skills, because actually the business doesn't care whether or not you're good at active listening. What the business cares about is, can you develop a new piece of AI that's going to increase your productivity by X% or something like that. So again, L&D is a great position to be able to proactively have conversations with the business about its strategy and then link that through to the people intervention, essentially. So I would say there's a step 1 in any of this. The step 1 is find out what the strategy is from all of your most senior people in your business. If they don't have a strategy, help them work one out and then make it tangible. So figure out, at a measurable, practical level, what are the tangible outputs of the strategy? And then you've got something to go after that's proactive, rather than you waiting for the business to come to you with a demand for some training. Go out to them proactively and find out what their strategy is and what their hot skills are. And then you've got the forward momentum rather than waiting for them to come to you. Okay, I think those are all of my kind of lessons learned on skills. There is a white paper. I'll just post the link into chat. It's probably the easiest thing. If you'd like to download it, I'll put it into chat. There's a lot of the thinking that we've got in there as well. And I'd be delighted if you connected with me on social media like LinkedIn. It's Charlie Kneen. Kneen, K is silent, KNEN. Feel free to reach out and connect with me and have another conversation afterwards. But that's everything that I've learned about skills so far. There's more to say, but I think we're kind of out of time. So any more questions and comments, we'd like delighted to hear those.
Well, firstly, thank you so much, Charlie, for those insights. I think the skills discussion is something that, well, we will keep having for many, many months, many years to come, as things change in this space. So thank you so much for sharing your insights today. Firstly, let's just give Charlie a virtual round of applause, as best we can using Zoom. So thank you so much. We've got time for a couple of questions just before we close. So Phil, I think you've got your hand raised first. Anyone, please do drop your questions in the chat though, and I'll try and get to them.
Yeah, Charlie. So first of all, it's great to finally hear somebody saying about start where it hurts and go there rather than trying to kind of go org wide and just have career frameworks, because careers are squiggly lines, right? I was just intrigued about, on one of your slides, you mentioned that buying skill directories is often leads to inaccurate taxonomies, but building it out yourself leads to, well, it's complex and time consuming.
Time consuming, yeah.
What's your middle ground? What's your thoughts on how you, because it kind of sounds like you're saying both is the wrong, but what's the right way for you to build out a framework?
I think it's a hard skills thing. I think it's don't build out a skills taxonomy. I think people can have profiles in your organization, but ultimately, I think what it's about is who in your company has the skills that you need to achieve your strategy. Yeah, I think it's do neither. Focus on what the business needs to achieve its strategic goals.
Cool. And I thought that's what you were alluding to. I just wanted to check. It's the first person I've heard in in the whole industry that's kind of taken the same view as me, actually. So
oh, there you go. Great to agree. Good stuff. Thanks.
Yeah, serendipity there. That's always good. Any final questions for Charlie before we close?
What was your question? I think Arash was going to ask a question. Arash.
Sorry, Arash.
I suppose a bit of crystal ball gazing. Where do you kind of see this heading in the next kind of suppose 12 to 24 months in terms of the skills? Do you think it's there's actually going to be more progression, or do you feel like actually L&D is going to fall into the trap that we've kind of fell into in the past, where we end up just trying to use it as another way of content dumping?
Yeah, I think it's going to do that. Basically, I wish I was more hopeful, but I think that what's fundamentally broken about L&D, and I would say we're probably more of a consultancy than an L&D company now. I'd say when we started, we definitely had a foot firmer in the L&D camp, but I think we've definitely become more of a business consultancy and strategic consultancy that does experience design and all that good stuff. And I think that what's fundamentally broken about the industry that we're in is that people don't understand how the human brain works. And there's a really good article called The Empty Brain, which is by no relation, but it's got a guy called Robert Epstein, who used to be the Psychology Today editor. He basically talks about the fact that the most advanced technology that we have becomes the metaphor for how the human brain works. So you hear people talk about processing and memory and storage and things like that, whereas the human and there's this kind of old kind of Greek concept of the elephant and the rider and the unconscious and conscious brain. But and based partly on Nick Shackleton Jones's work as well, that's not how we are as human beings. And the idea of using content as an engine to drive behavior change in complex social systems, which are businesses, rather than thinking about systemic changes and structure structure of the business that's driving behavior. So I think fundamentally, the reason we fall into these traps, or L&D falls into the traps, is because it's based on bad psychology. And until that changes, I think we're going to be doing the same thing, which is looking for fixes through technology, thinking that content is a solution to problems. But you know what? Clients are probably still going to buy it. So if you're an L&D company, agency out there who's churning out e-learning content, you're probably still going to be good for another 10 years at least. So I would say it's not all doom and gloom from that perspective, but I do think if you want to actually do something that's going to make a difference, I think that, particularly with things like skills, you're better off starting from the ground up and thinking about, ultimately performance and revenue, rather than how can we get more people to look at our stuff, because nobody cares.
Well, on that bombshell, thank you once again, Charlie, for the fantastic session today, and we really appreciate you sharing your insights with our learning development community. So thank you once again, Phil, Charlie, for all your efforts today. If you're a member of the Learning Network, you'll be able to access the recording of today's webinar and share those resources will be shared by the members dashboard very shortly after this session. If you're not a member and you've enjoyed today's session, it's just £29 a year to join. That's about $40, and you can join at thelearning-network.org, and it supports not only your development but also helps us offer more events like this. So thank you once again, Charlie, and everybody for joining today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you on another Learning and Network event very soon.